Hi, this is Vic Galloway, and in part 2 of Indie-pendent Scotland, I continue to trace the roots of Scottish indie record labels and the unique people who have brought us cutting-edge music from the 1980s to the present day. Creation Records was set up in London in 1983, the brainchild of Glasgow boy Alan McGee. One of his most significant early discoveries were two brothers from East Kilbride, Jim and William Reid, better known to you and me as the Jesus and Mary chain.
Well, the Jesus and Mary chain we just, found through the club, the living room, and, we made the record for £172. All the records we'd put out from that point, it was just friends, really, and they played the club and it was successful and it kind of just exploded, really. We sold about 50,000 copies of that track, Upside Down,
Mark Mackey, who went on to work with promoters Regular Music, was blown away by the band.
Jesus and Mary Chain I adored. I used to do their gigs, the very early ones where I had to put up a sign, tonight's performance might only last 14 minutes. And I think the NME photographed one of my handwritten signs at the door, do not come past this area unless you agree this fact. But no, the Mary Chain were fantastic, a very influential band. And McGee was just a genius with this whole Svengali way of building things up and building the vibe and the hype. I'd like to say that I was influenced by Scottish labels, but I would be lying. I was really influenced by Wham Records, and I was influenced by Rough Trade, and I was influenced by Factory. Definitely Postcard and Fast Records were like an inspiration, especially Alan Horn probably, just because he's such a character. To be honest, I thought, apart from, the Fire Engines and Restricted Code, I had no real musical affinity with what was going on. I always thought it was too twee, really, and too Bearsden, and sort of too middle class, and a bit wimp. My mum was a shop assistant, and my dad was a panel beater, and I was supposedly going to be an electrician, but I kind of rebelled against my family and decided that I was going to be in the music business in some form or another. And probably, if anything, hopefully a lot of them got out at that anybody, if you really want it bad enough, don't give in and you can do it,
Another band to grab Alan's attention was Teenage Fan Club, fronted by Bells Hill's Norman Blake.
What you do to me.
I was sort of friendly with the guys from Primal Scream, and they had a club in Glasgow called Splash One, and that became a focus for a number of different people. The Pastels were there, Primal Scream, and every month they would do these amazing pop art sort of posters. I think Bobby Gillespie had worked at a printer or something, and so I occasionally would help those guys sort of plaster those posters around town. But they had amazing bands on there, and I sort of met Alan McGee through that initially. And Alan had been aware of our group and had sort of said, if you're ever looking to move on to a new label, give me a call and, we can talk. And that's what we did.
What you do to me. I know
Stuart Braithwaite of Mogwai was also massively influenced by the Creation ethos.
Creation Records, along with Factory, is probably my favourite record company ever. And knowing the kind of Scottish element of that, the Teenage Fan Club and the Primal Scream, even earlier on, they put out the Pastels and all that, kind of the BMX Bandits and everything. So I thought it was definitely kind of, knowing that a Scottish guy had kind of managed to pull that one off was quite impressive.
Creation went on to have major success with Oasis, Primal Scream and My Bloody Valentine. In August 2000, Alan McGee shut up shop, but right now he's still involved in music via his Pop Tones label. Back in the 80s, others were getting involved in the DIY philosophy.
I remember the first gig I ever promoted at Glasgow University at the QM came to me a friend of mine who ran No Strings Records. It was two friends of mine who ran it, in fact, Nick Lowe and Graham Cochrane. And the funny thing about No Strings Records was they had Delamitri and Kevin McDermott, I think it was the Swed Crocodiles at that point. And the great thing was New Order were coming to town, and New Order were very unconventional. They didn't work with professionals in many areas of their work. And when it came to concert promotion, they were quite happy for amateurs to promote the concert, keep the money or their profits, and start a record label on the back of it. And that's how No Strings Records came about. New Order said, you can promote our gig. The profit you make from it, you put into that record label. Fantastic. So that's why Delamitri and Kevin got their first break around that time.
Yes, you read him like an open book, a waterfall man, a sentimental bloke. You teamed him up with a silent big sister who needed Dutch courage just to speak a Chinese whisper. Having borrowed him a heart from the news and blue moon glow, you saw yourself sickness to be just another way to grow. See me, sing my idiocy and vanity.
No Strings Records went on to release 3 singles by Delamitri, the Swede Crocodiles and the Incredible Blondes, and a mini-album by Kevin McDermott. The label folded in 1986, and No Strings Records soon became No Money Records, though a comeback is on the cards this March. Meanwhile, in Edinburgh, Stephen Pastel had a vision of his own.
53rd and 3rd started in the 80s. It was Edinburgh based. It was really instigated by David Keegan from the Shop Assistants. People from Fast Distribution made it possible for him to start up, but then just at that time the Shop Assistants were becoming successful, so I started to help David, and you know, it was my idea to release records by the Vaselines, for instance, and to be honest, things like the Vaselines were a bit of a joke, but it was good to put their music out. You know, I knew it was good.
She said she'd take me anyway, she'd take me everywhere, as long as she stays with me. She said she'd take me everywhere, she'd take me everywhere, as long as I'm good and clean. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. She said she'd take me every time, she'd take me anytime, as long as she stays with me. She said she'd take me every day, she'd take me anyway, and it would be free. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. Kiss, kiss.
At that time there was good infrastructure to get all the music into record shops, and there were more interesting record shops at the time. You know, you could walk into a record store in Kirkcaldy and buy a Jesus and Mary chain or a Pastels record, you know, things that you just can't do now, that there's 2 or 3 specialist record shops in the whole of Scotland.
She said she'd take me anyway, she'd take me everywhere, as long as she stays with me. She said she'd take me everywhere, she'd take me anywhere, as long as I'm good and clean. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips. Kiss, kiss, Molly's lips.
The Vaselines were formed in Edinburgh in 1987 by Eugene Kelly and Francis McKee. Kurt Cobain regularly cited the Vaselines' influence in interviews, and Nirvana went on to cover Molly's Lips and Son of a Gun. The group dissolved in 1989, but briefly reunited the following year to open for Nirvana in Edinburgh. Stephen Pastel may have pulled the plug on 53rd and 3rd, but he currently releases the music that he loves via his own label, Geographic.
We started Geographic, myself and Katrina and Lawrence, to document music that otherwise probably other people wouldn't. And, you know, we've been able to release records by Future Pilot AK and International Airport and the Bill Wells Trio. And I'm far happier with this label than with 53rd and 3rd, just because we just achieved things in a much better way. I think I'm really happy with how all the records come out now. We're more experienced.
Geographic continues to release great music. But back in 1991, the music scene was on the verge of a major change. DJs, decks and effects were taking over, and Glasgow's Soma Records were on the ball. Stuart McMillan and Ord Meikle.
A lot of the labels that started in Glasgow during the 80s, in fact, were probably kind of blueprints for what we didn't want to be honest. Even though they had the kind of independent ethos, they were very much tied up in the kind of rock and roll scene, which was very nicely kind of hooked up to larger companies in London, and there was a kind of infrastructure in Scotland to deal with kind of band music or rock music. When we came along, we didn't really have a model to base anything on, so it really was starting from the very roots, you know, publishing 1,000 records, putting out 1,000 records, using the profit to publish another 1,000 records, and it was very much hand-to-mouth kind of existence. But the first real major success was Positive Education, our albatross. But yeah, Positive Education was the first major success for the label and really kind of launched us on not only a success path within the UK, but it made Soma known internationally.
We grew up with bands like The Clash, and, you know, although they'd signed to CBS, I think the punk ethic was still there with us. You know, it was always a thing that we held really close to our hearts, and we didn't really want major record companies coming in and spoiling the party, if you like. We didn't really want that. We wanted to do our own thing. We wanted to see an achievement at the end of the day.
I think if you were in a rock band in the middle 90s, you'd had to have done something really spectacular to get any column inches, to be honest. It was all dance, you know, everything new that was happening, most editorials, everyone had club pages and stuff like that. And at the moment we're seeing a return to the kind of more rock-based, band-based kind of thing. Every dog has its day, you know, and at the moment it's obviously kind of rock and jangly guitars.
But guitars were around in the 90s, and you could hear them to great effect on Creeping Bent Records, fronted by Douglas McIntyre.
The impetus for starting the label was probably the Leopards. I had known Mick Slavin from the Leopards from years ago, being in the Jazzateers, and he played me some of his material, and it was just outrageous, sort of surf music meeting the Voidoids. I borrowed £2,000 from a friend and ran the label pretty much from my flat. After about 2 7-inch singles, we did a 12-inch single, which was a remix of the Suicide track Frankie Teardrop, and it was an NME single of the week, so we sold loads of copies of that, and that enabled us to take an office in Maryhill. think around when Creeping Bent started around 1994, there just seemed to be something in the air because Soma Records had sort of established itself as an outlet for dance music, and Chemical Underground started pretty much at the same time as Creeping Bent, and it just felt a very exciting time. I don't know what had happened. There may have been some influence from labels that had immediately preceded, like Creation Records perhaps, but it was a very vibrant time, and I don't think Scotland or Glasgow's looked back since then, really.
And another Scottish label that hasn't looked back is Chemical Underground, whose music has made a great impact on Idlewild's Roddy Womble.
For me, Chemical Underground was the kind of... Because I was like 17, 18 when they put out like Monica Webster, the Delgado single and things like that. I remember going to see Delgados play at early shows and Biss and Mogwai and all those groups like Arab Strapple, and it did seem like that was something that was really legitimate, that they'd started that themselves and they were really making the music that they wanted to make. And at the time, when we were starting out, we thought about doing the same thing, like starting a label, but ultimately we realised that one, you need kind of like a business sense and an idea of where to go. And, you know, although none of us are idiots, and Colin, our drummer in the band, you know, he handled that side of the band for years, you know, and he's very competent in that. We just decided that we'd rather put our records out to someone else, you know. If someone else could do a better job, then we would probably mess it up. But yeah, I suppose that Chemical Underground was a label that when I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s and getting into bands and getting into music, I was definitely, well, partly because all the music was so good, you know, the Mogwai, Arab Strap and Delgados were three of Scotland's sort of best bands, and they were on the same label at the time.
Paul Savage and Emma Pollock, part of the team behind the label.
It was back in 1995 that we put out the first record, and it was the Delgados' debut single. And it was pretty much a simple case of deciding that we'd started the band in 1994. We'd spent the majority of that year playing live, and then we realised that the time had come to put something out, but we were so cynical even at that stage of the music industry in general, and E&R people coming up from London and kind of telling you what you were doing wrong, that we just thought, well, first of all, we're not really interested in committing to a deal because we didn't really feel ready, and secondly, we had always had an interest in doing something like that ourselves. So it was just the perfect time to try it. And really, back then, when we were completely ignorant and didn't really realise how big a task it could be, we just put together a few £100 from each of us, and that gave us enough money to simply record and to press up a single. And that was it. That was all it needed.
I got a friend called Monica Webster. She's got a friend called Kiko Webster. Buddy and cheesecake, Kiko Webster. Happens all the time, kids cry out Monica Webster. Buddy and cheesecake, Kiko Webster. Might be the reason I ain't so webster. Underneath this whole shoot some roofs with Kenny Webster. Sticky on knife with Sue Webster. Hiding on the pipe with Webster. All across the town, happens all the time, kids cry out Monica Webster. Buddy and cheesecake.
The first thing after the Delgados that we went on to do was Biss. We met them in the 13th Note and just pretty much approached them in the pub and just said, you know, we really like what you're doing. Do you have any plans for putting it out? And told them that we'd done it once, you know, with our single, and we thought we had it covered. You know, we were pretty clued up by then. We were really arrogant, you know. Back then we thought that we were always right. If we knew everything that we know now, I think we'd probably think twice about like doing certain things. So, you know, just asked them if they were interested, and they'd bought the single, so they were really interested in the packaging. I remember Stephen was really curious about how the thickness of the card on the 7-inch, you know, it's that kind of thing can swing it back then. So yeah, we said we'd get them the same kind of card, and the deal was done.
It's always been about your word, and it's always been about honouring what has been talked about, because it's always an independent music company, if you like, is always born out of passion and never out of logic, because if it was born out of logic, most people would probably decide not to do it. It's the passion for it that basically starts the whole thing and then carries it through. Chemical Underground has been going now for 10 years, and we're just really, frankly, amazed that we're actually still here. As long as we can do this, we're going to keep doing it.
Students at Stowe College in Glasgow were also keen to get involved. They set up their own imprint, Electric Honey Records, and approached a new band, Belle and Sebastian. Stuart Murdoch explains how they got their first break on Radio Scotland.
Peter Easton and Beat Patrol were the very first people to ever play anything of mine on the air. Later on they played another demo, Electronic Renaissance, and in fact the Beat Patrol programme had a part to play in the making of our first LP record, because I just happened to be taping Beat Patrol that night when Electronic Renaissance came on, and I taped it off the radio. This was just a tape demo that they were playing, and I taped it off the radio, but something was happening between the airways and the big compressors over that you've got, the big limiters they've got. It sounded better. Well, I thought it sounded better when I played the tape back. So what we did when we mastered Tiger Milk, we mastered the cassette that I taped off Beat Patrol. So thanks to Beat Patrol for that.
Right here, right now, Scotland has never been healthier. There are so many great new bands and labels, such as Breastfed, KFM, Benbecula, SL and Fence, to name a few. Sadly, we don't have time to play their artists and feature their future releases. 70s indie pioneer Bob Last draws a comparison with his early post-punk days.
It's exciting to see people excited by Franz Ferdinand, but for me, it's completely bizarre. It's like I keep hearing some demo that we forgot to listen to on the radio. I don't mean demo in an insulting way, but it's, they're obviously so much immersed in those kind of reference points of things that we were doing in the bands we were amongst. It's really quite strange to hear them. It's like a kind of time slip.
Postcard records certainly had a significant influence on us. We found a lot of these records like Orange Juice and Fire Engines and Joseph K and Aztec Camera. It was quite easy to come by these records in charity shops or bargain bins, because during the sort of 90s when I sort of started getting kind of train spotty about music.
Franz Ferdinand have won 2 Brit Awards, a Mercury Music Prize, and sold millions of records. But they've done it all with an indie label.
They heard about us in London and came up to see one of our concerts in the art school and liked it so much that Lawrence Bell just came up to us afterwards and said, I love what you're doing, and everybody else that we talked to that evening as well. There were a lot of record companies that evening there. All the others that we talked to had said, like, yeah, I love what you're doing. You could change this and change that. And Lawrence was the only one that just said, we just want to put out your records, thinking, great, just do what you want to do, And that's how it happened, really. And he was just a great guy to talk to, really easygoing and independent as well, yeah. So what more could we ask for?
Indie-pendent Scotland was presented by Vic Galloway, produced by Helena Gallagher, and mixed by Neil Young.